Hello everyone, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I talk about design system because that's the only thing they let me talk about, right? Because there's like 30 talks about Redux, and there's like this one person who says, hi, I want to talk about design system. So that's like a CFP hack for you all. Just talk about things nobody else wants to talk about. So, hi, I hope you all had like a nice lunch. I'm too full to be doing this talk right now. I'm Sid. You already saw my long name and probably like gave up reading it halfway. I do the same, my mom does the same, so everyone just calls me Sid. I'm a developer at Code Sandbox, and I want to talk to you about design systems. So in 2019, it kind of feels like everyone is shouting design systems at like the top of their lungs and won't shut up, right? It's like, what do you say? It's like super hot right now, right? Kind of like other things that are super hot right now, right? And how many folks of here use design system? Like design system is a thing at the place you work at. All right, a few hands, nice. How many folks have no idea what design system is and kind of too afraid to ask at this point? Right, so I had a friend who kind of came up to me, and he had a very honest question. He says, so I'm using Bootstrap, right? And it's a pretty cool design system. And that's like kind of a trigger thing, right? Like you go to someone who works on design system and say, there's this CSS library. It's a good design system, what do you think, right? Because a design system is a bunch of things, right? It's also like a CSS library, but it means a lot of things. And I kind of want to just like quickly gatekeep on what design systems are. So I really like this definition by Kai Sainen, who used to work at the design system team at Airbnb. He said that design systems are a set of multidisciplinary, shared, integrated principles and patterns that define the overall design of a product. That's a mouthful. So I'm going to break it down. What is it? It's principles and patterns that should be shared and integrated. And why would you bother to create like a well-consistent overall theme of a product, right? So let's quickly break them down. When I say principles are basically it's like rules and guidelines about colors and tone of your brand and things like spacing strategy, things that your designers seem to care too much about, but you can't really justify why, right? Patterns are things like we care about, like repeatable and reusable blocks of UI that you can just like combine and create your apps. So a React component library does fall into like this patterns part of it. What's more interesting to me is the quality, or more like the attributes of these principles and patterns. So you want them to be shared between your designers, developers, product managers, corporate, like basically everyone in the company should have the same set of principles and patterns that they go to, right? So when you're in a meeting and you say, let's use the secondary brand color, it should mean the same thing for everyone. And integrated is where all of the nerdy stuff becomes fun, where it needs to be integrated in a workflow, right? So as a designer, it should be in Sketch or Framework. As a developer, it's probably baked into your React components. I'm going to give examples because all of this sounds just stupid. And the goal is to define, and not just define, but also improve the overall quality of your product. And some of you might be wondering, wait, I kind of have some of these things, right? Am I a design system developer? Right? So if you're a designer and you consume a style guide, well, that's part of your design system. If you have a shared component library that everyone in the company uses, that's part of the design system, right? You already have some design decisions that are baked into those components, and every time you import that component into your app, you are importing all of those design decisions as well. That's part of a design system. So a design system could really mean different things for different companies. It usually depends on who cares about it the most. So I'm going to tell you about my last job where I worked in the design system team at Auth0. And the interesting thing about that team was that it was part of the design org, right? So we were like sitting, we were like a team of 3 or 4 people. We were sitting next to the illustrators, the marketing folks, and we were talking about React components and kind of just confusing everyone. And the engineering team was like all the way in the other side where they're talking about security and JWT, and Auth0 is like an authentication company. So we were kind of detached from that world. And it was part of the design org because the designers were the one who cared about this the most. So the design system for us meant a set of shared variables and assets that we could share between designers. You can call it a theme or a style guide, but also a set of React components that we could distribute to engineering, right? So it was kind of part of the design org, but we were basically shipping design decisions inside other people's code bases. An example of that would be, if you look at this API for like a page header component, the user of this component, right, the product developer, basically say this is the title, this is the description, there are some actions. And if you look at it, behind this mechanical prop API, there are a bunch of decisions hidden. Like what element should it be, right? So should it be an H1 or an H2? What font size is that? What is the distance between them? Should the primary action come first? Should the secondary action come first? How much spacing is there between these things? And do we give like a margin or just margin bottom? Like what's our spacing strategy? And other things like when the screen reader starts describing this to the user, a visually impaired user, what order should it speak in? Should it say the description first, or should it describe the actions first? So if you see, it's not just aesthetic decisions that are baked in, but a lot of decisions about layout and accessibility as well. And it kind of takes a lot of time to get those right. So you really want someone who cares about it, plus has a bunch of time to be actually able to work on it, right? For example, this is a component that I really like. So you have like login to continue. It opens a dialog, right? And dialogues are super tricky because when you open a dialog, you kind of have to think about what should be focused, right? So if you have a form, then the accessibility guidelines say that the first form field should be focused. And then you start tabbing through, so you go to password, you should have like a nice state for your login form, login button. You should think about errors and stuff, and then what happens when you again press tab, right? Like if you go to the last field and you hit tab again, what should happen? So what usually happens when you open a website just goes outside of the tab because that's how the DOM would behave. What should happen is it should loop back and start at the first field of the form, right? So dialogues actually should trap focus inside of them. Of course, the platform doesn't really do that for you because we have like buttons and headers and sections, but we don't have a native dialogue element. So all of that kind of falls back to the people who build these reusable components, right? And this is kind of great because it gives the members of the design system team a lot of time to work on like error states and accessibility of tooltips, like incredibly deep rabbit holes that you can't really justify spending a week on, right? If you have to ship a login dialog and you say it's going to take me a week, it's not going to fly unless that is literally your job, right? The rabbit hole goes deeper because you also have to think about what happens on, like, if it's responsive, what happens on mobile. There's a keyboard that's going to pop up, what happens there. And I really like this article by Brad Frost. It was kind of controversial, but it was very relatable, where he said the front-end ecosystem is now so large that you kind of have the front of the front end and you have the back of the front end, and both of these are incredibly deep fields, right? It's really difficult for someone to be really good at the styling aspects and accessibility, but also at the same time be really good at something like TypeScript and GraphQL, right? Both of these are kind of part of our jobs now, but you just can't be good at both of them. So it really helped us to kind of have a team that focuses on one of the things while completely ignoring state management. Like everyone was struggling with Redux, and I was writing CSS. Oh, that was pretty cool. So that worked out. We shipped it to the product team. They were pretty happy. They didn't have to write CSS. That kind of solves half the problem for most developers. So let's see. So it was great for the product people, but then the documentation team kind of came in and said, you guys seem to have built something cool. We would also like to use it, right? And you kind of have to think about documentation and blog pages as a slightly different product. Because if you look at a UI, so this is GitHub, right? If you look at the spacing and buttons, it's kind of really crowded. It's a very compact API, compact UI. But if you look at their blog, it has a lot more room, right? The font sizes are bigger, the spacing is larger, and that's kind of how documentation and blogs go. So even though it's the same company, and we wanted to give them our stuff, we just couldn't because our components did not really fit their needs, right? It's the same company. We ended up giving them a lot of our variables, but they had to build their own components on top of it. So kind of got me thinking of where we went wrong. And I forgot to mention this, where, of course, there's this like one team that is stuck on jQuery, and they say they will rewrite to React, but they kind of never do, right? So we just had nothing for them, right? We wanted to give them stuff, but we just couldn't. And at the same time, I I think it was this exact venue where I saw this talk from Diana Mounter, who works at GitHub. And she introduced this phrase from a coworker, Sophie Shoemaker, called brand on a spectrum. And that really spoke to me. So the idea is that GitHub's design system doesn't just power their website, which is super compact, but also all of their marketing pages and like the Octo Universe conference that they do. It has to power all of this while having the same consistency of the brand, right? So her phrase, brand on a spectrum, kind of really made sense to me there. And that got me thinking about the multiple layers of design systems. So we wanted the documentation team to be able to take our component library, right, and tweak the fundamental, like tweak the, what do you call it, the bone structure of it, and adjust it to their own needs, instead of us saying, take our variables, build everything again, right? And what I'm saying isn't really new stuff, right? Clean code principles have been saying this for years, that choose your abstractions smartly. Don't abstract too early, because then you get logged in at an abstraction that is too high, and then you can't go down, right? But it got me thinking about that you kind of have to design systems. Right? You can't just start building components. You got to design how you build the design systems. Fast forward roughly a year, and then I found myself at like a 10-member startup, which is Code Sandbox. And even though it's like there are just 5 or 6 people that touch the front end of the application, we're already seeing some of the problems that we used to solve with design systems. So there are like design inconsistencies. There's duplication of a lot of similar elements. We're like 5 people, half of the people are still building buttons over and over again. And I kind of have to remind myself that just because I've worked on design system doesn't mean the solution is always design system, right? But I'd really like to start putting in the work. So instead of thinking about it like a hammer, I've kind of started thinking about it as a Swiss Army knife, right? Which has like a bunch of tools in it. And then those tools together can be used to make a design system, but we don't really need all of them, right? So basically a set of tools that can be shared by the team and integrated into the process, right? This sounds familiar. Essentially what I want is a system that helps me design a design system, right? Which is where this cheeky title, design system came from. I'm so sorry about that. But I kind of have to like break it down. What are all the things that we were doing when in the design system team? So thinking about tokens, documentation, use guidelines, there's a Gatsby theme, there's a Webpack preset. There was a lot of things. We don't really need all of these, right? It was kind of this super expensive Swiss Army knife, which I found on Amazon. And it even freaking comes in dark mode, right? But I'm not gonna pay 80, is it pounds? Is it dollars? Okay, I'm not gonna pay 80 pounds for a Swiss Army knife. That's crazy, right? What I really need is this, right? Like a part of the Swiss, like a cheaper, smaller Swiss Army knife that I can buy from the store and just use, right? So the rest of this talk essentially is things I'm going to steal from design system world, and you should too. The first one of them is constraint-based design. So the concept of constraint-based design is that when you start designing, you don't really have the world in front of you. You have a fixed set of variables that you're allowed to use, right? And when I say you, I don't just mean developers. I mean designers and developers and everyone in the team, right? And that theme is integrated into the components as well. So when you're building a component, the conversation shouldn't look like this, which is unfortunately something I did last week, right? Where I just pinged the designer, like, hey, this pink color that we have, which pink is it? And then he's like, let me check, and then paste the hex code. And have you noticed Slack actually renders a small box when you paste a hex code? Like, how far have we gone when our chat tool understands what hex codes are and renders it? Like, it seems like we're going in the wrong direction, right? What you really want to do, does it play? Is something like this, where inside your editor, when you say colors, you should be able to get an autocomplete and just pick. These are the colors we have. I want to pick one of them, right? And then the conversation is, I want the brand 500 and not hash D, I don't know whatever. What I'm trying to say is you want to make the right thing extremely easy to do, right? And even inside like the 10-member team I work in, not everyone cares equally about design, right? Like we have folks that deeply care about state and types. I couldn't care less, right? But you need different people to care about different things. That's what makes a really good team. And it's kind of now my job to make the right design choice really easy for my coworkers to consume, right? Because they would rather work on the types, right? which I really appreciate. So another way to rephrase it, it should be more hard work to introduce an inconsistency than just to follow the consistent design, right? And you know developers, right? All of us, we would rather just copy paste the first answer from Stack Overflow than implement the whole thing ourselves. So if you make inconsistent work more difficult, it just wouldn't happen. So how do you get the autocomplete fanciness, right? You kind of need to do some work for that. So first you have to define a theme or tokens. Can say it multiple ways. I just like saying a theme now. And it would be really cool if there was like a specification so that you don't have to reinvent it. Luckily, there are a bunch. The one I really like these days is this thing called System UI. This is the one underneath Gatsby's theming system as well. And it kind of just looks like this. You say, I want a bunch of colors. I'm going to define them. And you say, these are all my colors. And you see, I've kind of laid them out on a grid of 100, 200, 300. Like, when I started laying out colors last year, I would just call them gray, and gray darker, and gray darkest, and then go lighter, lightest. But then you kind of are bound to like 6 or 5 shades, and then you have to introduce another one. So you're like darkest mode, or like darker than the darkest, right? And then, which always happens is like your designer comes back and say, we need a shade of gray between these two, right? Between darker and darkest. And then it's just like screwed, because you're not going to call it darkish, right? So this kind of comes from the world of color theory, where you just lay them on a scale, and that's why you see a gradient. And then you give yourself a lot of room in between. So you see, some of these are actually not even defined. Like, I don't have a 600, right? Because I don't know what to put there, but I know I will one day need another gray, and that's where it's going to come in, right? It also lets you cheat that if you really want, you can introduce something between 100 and 200, right? Just call it 150. You usually only want to do that when you like have a color palette, and then you realize, we screwed up, all our colors suck. We want to change them without making breaking changes, right? So you introduce like a parallel palette on 150, 250, 350, 450, and then you migrate to it, right? Defining other colors is easier because we just have 2 blues, right? It's easier not to create too many blues. But your theme doesn't have to stop there, right? You can also, because now we're talking JavaScript, you can just attach objects. So for example, colors.brand is actually an alias for colors.blue. So when I want to use a brand color, I don't say blue 500, I say brand 500, right? So I create variables first, and then I'm adding decisions on top of that. Same thing goes for text. Like I say, these are the 3 text colors that we use. This is the default one. A heading one is slightly lighter. I don't know, Danny said so. And then I have a subtle color, right? The interesting thing is, this is not just in my React code base. It's also in Figma, right? So when Danny, our designer, is making something, he actually selects a color from the palette inside Figma, right? So when I say integrated, it's actually integrated in everyone's tool. And when I'm looking at a design, I really don't care what hex code is it. I just look at the label, and I'm like, this is text subtle. I have a text.subtle. I'm just going to use that, right? The theme doesn't stop there. You can keep on defining things. So I have like font sizes, space, a bunch of shadows. I don't like the names because you know what's going to happen. I'm going to need something in between, right? Another way of like calling not in an open, actually, let me look at this. So space, if you look at, is just an array because it's kind of an open set. But it follows a grid. It follows the 4-point grids. I have 4, 8, 12, something. Shadows, there is no scale, there is no grid, right? But one of the popular approach people do is t-shirt sizes. So you get extra small, small, medium, large, XL, and then if you really screwed up, then you can always say extra, extra small, or baby sized, right? Infant clothing. But it kind of forces you to restrict yourself. React conference is not complete without saying this. Write once, use everywhere. And there are a bunch of tools that kind of let you do this. So one of these is by a very tiny author, and the other one is by a very big author. So DS tools / theme CSS actually takes your JavaScript theme file and reads something that looks like this and spits out CSS variables, right? If you look at this, this is kind of my variables file, and it spits out CSS variables. So the marketing team or the home page, which doesn't really use React yet, could also benefit from the same things. Theo by Salesforce UX is kind of more hardcore. They have a configurable YAML. So you write your tokens in YAML, and then you can spit out Sass, CSS, JSON, whatever you want. Even lets you do XML for the Android folks, right? It's pretty, I mean, it's Salesforce. They have a lot of people. And remember this more spacious, bigger font size block thing that I showed you earlier? You could also use, what happens now is that you import the base theme, and then you can just override it, right? They still want the same shadows and colors. What they would really love is like a more spacious grid and some bigger font sizes, right? So they just reset some of the defaults, and they get they get like a more spacious theme while keeping the components the same. Let's actually look at the components now. So how would you use a theme like this inside components? I'm going to use style components because, emotion and style components are kind of the same at this point, but I just like the authors more. But it's a thing, right? So yeah, you import style components, you import the theme, and then instead of saying color is a hex code, you just say color is theme.colors.text.subtle, right? And if you're using VS Code, then you already get autocomplete, and it kind of rules. It's pretty cool. This is like a fun, style components actually also has like a theme provider that you can use. So instead of importing theme in every file, you can just push it at the root of your application and get something like this, where theme is now part of props. I really like this approach because what usually happens is when you start trying to theme things, your app is already so inconsistent when you start. So what you want is to start in smaller places, right? You want just the dialogue to be the new theme instead of the whole app. So you can wrap the dialogue in a theme provider and use it internally. Like, you don't have to do everything in one go. You can kind of climb up there. And then every style component that you create gets theme inside props. This is like a fun utility from Style System. Style System is a pretty cool library. It does a bunch of things. I really like this one utility they wrote. The funny part is Style System and the system UI theme spec are from the same people. So it already understands all the underlying definition. And then you can get rid of a bunch of redundancy. Like, I really hate saying color picks from props.theme.colors. Like, color will pick from colors, right? Same goes for font size. Props.theme.font sizes too feels a little redundant. So it just lets you do this, right? You say font size is the second one, and text color is text.subtle, right? I kind of love it. My teammates hate this, so we don't get to do this. But what I really like about this is when you're actually building something and you have font size 2 and it kind of looks too small, you can bump it up to 3. Why do I bother? So you can bump it up to 3, and then you already know that you're not jumping to arbitrary sizes. You're actually jumping from one design-approved size to the next one, and you're kind of prototyping with those exact numbers, right? So I've kind of stopped going into dev tools and just trial and error trying to figure out what looks good and paste it back into my CSS. Instead, I'm just tweaking values now. And we kind of got really lucky that we built this at a good time, because we just shipped something last week where we started off, we're doing some redesigns inside the company. So we started off with this font size, font scale, and it looks really dope inside Figma, but looks like crap inside Chrome, right? Have you folks seen that? Like, it looks good in the design tool because of how they render the fonts, but just doesn't look good in the browser. So kind of had realized that the font has a different rendering pattern for Chrome and Firefox. So we just had to bump up the font size to make it look even legible. Luckily, we had the scale, so we just deleted the first one and added one to the end, and everything kind of grew up. And it kind of just looks pretty cool. We got lucky that we just had to change one thing instead of doing the whole redesign and Danny and me sitting together and pointing at our screens and with oily fingers. Which is pretty cool, right? Now, they told me that this is React Advanced. I shouldn't talk about basic concepts, right? Most of the things I do is kind of basic. So I'm going to just give you some food for thought. Something that I've recently been exploring is having a theme JS is cool. What is really cool? Having a theme TS, right? I should have that smart guy meme. So now what you do is when you're typing something, right, and you just don't feel like text.subtle is doing it, and you want to change it, you can't, because TypeScript will literally scream at you inside the editor, right? And that's something, initially I found it really annoying, because I just don't like being screamed at, right? When somebody tells me, you don't know how to code, I'm like, I already know, stop, right? But what I really appreciate in this is CSS has been a visual medium for super long, right? And the easiest or the only way to see if what you have written works was to have a browser open and see if it looks the way you want it to look. Having this feedback inside the browser has kind of made it really, really easy to not make those mistakes, right? Like if I'm breaking the, like I'm not going to do that weird hex code thing, but if I just use the wrong label and it doesn't match the allowed allowed colors for background, this thing literally shouts at me and says, nope, you can't use this. You can only use this set or this enum values from this enum, which is super cool. So yeah, theme.ts is the advanced thing for you. There's a bunch of DesignOps that I think is pretty cool, but I'm not going to talk about. But I just want to hint at some of it, which is Figma recently built their read API, and it's super cool. But now they're also working on plugins, which helps you write into Figma. I think that's really smart. And I've kind of been rethinking what should be the source of truth for some of these things, right? Like, we've already established that code should be the source of truth, and then you import that into your design tools. For some things, I feel it doesn't really add up, because something like icons in SVG, Danny literally designs those icons in Figma, and then we right-click export, and then we say, this is the source of truth, which doesn't really make sense, because when he changes things, you also have to sync it. So some of those things kind of have to go the other way around. And there are a bunch of really cool tools. So there's SVG to JSX by my awesome coworker. Kind of saved me a bunch of hours there. There's styled system Figma, which I think is really impressive because it ties into the theme that we've been using really well. So if you have a bunch of colors, it actually exports them in the theme that you would want to use. So I'm now started thinking maybe the whole theme should be in Figma. And then I literally wrote this after the last talk, Figma GraphQL party, because I think it's really cool. And then the more we import, or the more we sync between our design tools and dev tools, the more it's going to be great for everyone, because we can just stop repeating ourselves. The last thing I want to kind of show to you, and this is a bit scandalous for a React conference, where you actually do want CSS, right? You're writing CSS in JS, but sometimes you just want it to give you CSS. I'm not talking about static extraction. I'm talking about human-readable CSS that people who are not using React, the folks that in the company are stuck with jQuery, can also benefit from. They just want a class name that they can type, right? And this part is super experimental, so I've just been playing around with it. I don't have a repo for it. You can DM me if you want to try it out. Kind of starts like this, where this is what we have right now, right? I have my style components and my CSS utility from style system. And I've been thinking if I just write it in tiny different way, where I just make an object of it, and then I give it to style components. And if you look at this object, it doesn't really look anything like CSS, or it doesn't really look like a language we know. It just looks like styles, right? And that got me thinking about what's the best experience of authoring styles, right? Not to style things, but just authoring your decisions. And can I actually just create a style object with my form, with my label? It has some metadata in it, the form should render a form, so that style components knows what to do. But it started looking like a configurable theme kind of thing really fast, right? And this is the unpublished tool that you can DM me for. But essentially, this is what I was writing, right? And if you think about it, this looks an awful lot like CSS, right? Which kind of got me thinking, can we just write our styles inside JavaScript, feed it to style components so that we get all of the hashing and all of the prop interpolation and a bunch of cool things. But also, if I export, do I have that? Yeah, if I just started exporting these styles outside, I could read them outside of React, outside of the code base essentially, and just look for form anything, star.styles.js files, take what they export, and just spit out CSS from them, and then I have a CSS library. So it's kind of experimental. It works most of the time, but there are so many cases that just don't. But yeah, I have 30 seconds, which is perfect. The only kind of takeaway I want for you folks is get your own Swiss knives, right? There's a bunch of things from other, in the design world and the design system world, that we should just steal, right? They have some good ideas. They're mostly crap, but they have some good ideas, which we could just steal and make our own Swiss Army knives. I like this one. It does one thing, and it has somebody else's name. I don't know. Right? I don't know why would you buy this on Amazon. Anyways. So thanks. The resources for my talk are on this URL, and if you like crap like this, you should follow me. Thank you.